these things have deteriorated markedly since the 1950s. Despite the fact that in the 1950s the country was coming out of the catastrophe of the Second World War, the economy was microscopic compared to what it has since become. The empire was falling apart. It didn't seem to be a particularly radiant period in the country's history. Nonetheless, it does seem that people were a good deal happier there. And women in particular, the survey found, were happier then than they are now. This provoked a good deal of soul-searching, and a number of explanations were promoted, none of them particularly credible. The one that the BBC seemed to conclude was the case was the fact that children are now brought up with unrealistic expectations thanks to mass media and inappropriate enculturation. But the real reason, of course, is understood by believers, because we know the fact that is not a particularly profound or obscure one, but is the basic religious insight, which is that human sa'ada is to do with a state of the soul, to do with security, optimism, a sense of direction, a sense of meaning, a sense of the value of self-sacrifice that secularity, by its nature, cannot really supply. The real problem is that there is a major hole now in the British psyche and psychology, with the collapse of traditional religion and the absence of any credible spiritual alternative. So when we look at the tsunami of gadgets that's arriving now from the West and from the civilization of the West, what we will not find is, as a consequence of this, greater social stability, greater human happiness, a greater sense of self-worth. Instead, we will find, at best, the possibility of being distracted from the central gap in our consciousness, which is the gap where spirituality used to be. Increasingly, that is the function of technology, to provide distraction and entertainment, to prevent us from looking at the catastrophic reality, which is that where there was once meaning and truth, now there is confusion and relativism. That is the modern world. It is a brilliant series of distractions. As a leading writer on technology, Max Frisch, used to say, technology is the method that human beings employ to prevent them from experiencing the world. By which he meant that the real world, that which we have to engage with if we're truly to be at ease with ourselves, is the world of nature, and is the world of the spirit within. That particular author was not particularly religious, but knew that a traditional constituent of humanity was a spiritual quest, an artistic quest, the belief that underneath the forms of the material world there is a principle of unity and symmetry and beauty. If we've lost that, then what we need desperately is technology in order to prevent us from realizing how unhappy we have become. That is not ishraq, that is the ghafla and the sophisticated techniques, the new cars, the iPod, the BlackBerry, the latest gadget, whatever it is, that prevents us from looking into this great abyss, which is the fact of modern anomie and meaninglessness. And the extent to which technology can keep up with the widening of this gulf is something that is unguessable. And what happens when people simply, when one generation decides that it is no longer persuaded by science, technology, and the world of distraction, and starts looking once again into that gulf again, is too terrible to contemplate. But at the moment, most people, like children, are happy with the distractions. But the East is still the place of ishraq. The East is where serious people still go to look for meaning. And the fact that the East often seems to be technically behind and structurally decrepit should not, in the eyes of serious seekers, be taken as a discommendation. In fact, it is probably a good sign. If the East is lagging behind in terms of the acquisition of ever more meaningless technique, then that is probably a commendation. The fact that there are still people who value leisure, who value contemplation, who value prayer and meditation, who value spending time with their families rather than more and more hours every day at the office in order to generate a healthier and healthier bank balance, in order to enable them to buy more and more of the techniques of distraction, is certainly a good sign. We need to acquire a prophetic perception of the modern world if we are not to share in its unhappiness. And that prophetic perspective is necessarily a radical one. Properly speaking, there is no intellectually coherent way of being a moderate Muslim. If you understand a moderate Muslim as being somebody who basically believes in the underlying logic of the modern world. Because if you try and square that circle, If you try and accept the basic premises of a competitive, Darwinian, dog-eat-dog materialism, and say, yes, but you also believe in the Quran and the Sunnah, then you are living a contradiction that eventually will cause a spiritual crisis and spiritual death. You'll be carrying a burden that eventually will become too much for you, particularly if you're intelligent. For people who are really dumb, it might be possible to think, yes, I can live this materialistic, atheistic lifestyle in its forms, but the content is still going to be Islamic. But the intelligent people can see that you cannot square this circle, that it is actually spiritually and intellectually impossible, an absurdity, to try and live as fully part of an Enlightenment, secular, rationalist or post-rationalist civilization and still be committed to the revelation of the Quran. It simply does not work, because the focus of the Quran is Akhirah, not dunya. Of course, la tansa nasibaka min ad-dunya, don't forget your share of this world. The fact that we are dissidents within the modern world does not mean that we cannot drive cars and have mobile phones and those things. But what it does mean is that our look at those things, our regard for those things, is radically incommensurable with the regard that the secular mind has for those things. That we regard them as humorous tools and toys, and we give them no heed. We know that the man who spends less time with his family in order to save up for a fashionable new car is somebody who has not understood the Quran, somebody who has put prestige over happiness, somebody who has acquired a new object of dunya at considerable spiritual expense, simply in order to become more agitated. Perhaps the car will be scratched, perhaps the car will be stolen, perhaps something in it won't work, perhaps it'll be out of date next year and he'll need something even more fashionable. He is throwing away his precious time in this life in order to acquire something that will just be a source of misery for him. And if he looks carefully into his fate, and a few of us still do, he will recognize that he has struck a poor deal. But the believer is happier with what he has, even if it's a beat-up old car, simply because it takes him from A to B, because he is a life that genuinely has meaning and has a destination. You can't not call that a radical, dissident perspective. It's not really a moderate perspective. Politically, that person may be moderate or may seem to be quite indifferent in many ways, but in terms of the deep structures of modernity, which are not really about the show and outward form of the political game, but are to do with the manipulation of money, such a person is really an outsider and a dissident. Such a person will do things that make no sense at all, given the guiding presumptions of the modern world, like fasting in Ramadan, like giving away in charity without anybody, even his own family, noticing, like inculcating the memorization of the Holy Quran in his children, like thinking about eternity rather than the few short years that remain to him in this life. Such a person is strange. Such a person is, to use the prophetic language, gharib. And the intelligent Muslim is the one who recognizes his sense of essential estrangement in this world. And that is the nature of the believer in any case, in any generation. كن في الدنيا كأنك غريب أو عابر السبيل, as the hadith says. Be in the dunya as though a stranger or a traveller. We know the context of that. The Holy Prophet ﷺ was resting, and the Sahaba saw that there were marks left upon his blessed shoulder when he rose from lying down on a rough piece of straw matting. And they were distressed by this and suggested that something more comfortable be arranged for him, and these were his words. And those are the radical words. But true Islamic radicalism in our age does not mean envy and resentment because the other people have all of the gadgets and the power and the weapons. That is a kind of radicalism that is a radical concession to the logic of modernity, which is always a zero-sum game, because those who compete for the Akhirah know that Akhirah, being infinite, has enough for everybody, but those who compete for the dunya have to be in the grip of envy, because the resources of dunya are always finite. True radicalism of Islam in our age is a radicalism of looking at the dunya كَأَنَّكَ غَرِيبٌ أَوْ عَابِرَ السَّبِيلِ, as if you're a stranger or a wayfarer. And our consciousness is the consciousness of those who know that they are going somewhere a lot more interesting. Theirs is the consciousness of the people who look at the generations of mankind, stretching back who knows now how many hundreds of thousands of years, and recognize that the fact that they are in this age, and that theirs is the gift of consciousness and life and the ability to act in this age, is pure divine gift, that they are not now dead, that they are not waiting to be born, that they are coinciding with the current stage of temporality, is pure gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they are excited by that, filled with joy like a little child who opens his eyes and sees the miracle of the world and wishes to rejoice and be innocent and to be good and look for beauty, rather than our tendency always to seek out what is ugly and dirty and fleeting. And that should be the essential joy of the believer. The state of araba, of alienation, is a state of joy. Just as the state of uns with dunya, intimacy with dunya, really to love and to caress the brand new Toyota SUV which you've just bought, to be intimate with dunya is always a source of huzn and hazan, of grief and a roughness in the soul. This is the secret of the believer in this age. Khalwat dar anjuman, solitude in the crowd. Walking through the shopping centre with the Holy Quran in your mind and looking out for people who might need your help, rather than just being a sheep in the flock, obeying the marketing men. In other words, to be what the Sufis call in a state of hurriya, freedom. The modern world uses the word freedom a lot, but is incapable of supplying it on a spiritual level. Because the modern world is run essentially by money men, by accountants, by marketing men who wish to entrap us in our own desires. We know how powerful that can be. But the believer who is in the state of hurriya looks at his desires and gives his desires their due form. He does marry, he does have a car, he has children, he participates in a way that brings him happiness in this world, but looks towards the Akhirah constantly. And that is where his happiness is to be found. There really is no common measure between those two anthropologies, those two models of humanity. So when we say the modernization of Islam, a phrase that is frequently heard, we have to make sure that what this means is the perpetuation of Islam in its radical authenticity in a modern context, not the injection of the anti-religious logic of the materialistic modern world within Islam, an injection that eventually will kill it off because it's an inimical, dead, hostile, deadening principle. We are confronted, whether we like it or not, as Muslim thinkers, with the obligation to see what this metabolic relationship should be. And this is, in a sense, a more dangerous challenge than any that has yet faced the Ummah. We know that Imam al-Ghazali, rahmatullahi alayhi, recognized that he was in an age of crisis where a number of rival religiosities were threatening the aqidah of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And much of his life was spent in apologetic or polemical mode against the various alternative readings of the Islamic scriptures. But what we are facing today is something that is of a new type, which is that we are today returned not to the time of Imam al-Ghazali, which was a world of contesting sacralities. Even Ibn Sina certainly believed in God and believed in the virtues, but rather a reversion to that form of life which the Quran would describe as pharaonic. The collision that we are encountering today is a reprise of the most fundamental human collision, which is between nafs and ruh, instantiated in the Quran, with some of those great parabolic stories like the collision of Sayyidina Musa and Fir'aun. Fir'aun, who wanted to say, Ana rabbukum al-a'la, I am your greatest Lord. He is the ultimate humanist. He is the one who wants to put the human in the place of God. The human being is the Rabb A'la, the highest God. And what does he do? He asks for skyscrapers to be constructed. لَعَلِّي أَطَّلِعُ إِلَى إِلَهِ مُوسَى. Perhaps I shall go up there and have a look at the God of Musa. But I think that he's telling lies. And Fir'aun is the one who has a magical technology, whose magicians amaze him with their technique and come up with all kinds of interesting manipulations of matter in order to make him think that indeed he is the greatest Lord. That's one Quranic parabolic story that is told in order to illustrate this ancient challenge that materialism has to Iman. But there are others, and we find them equally in the cataclysmic challenge that Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam lays down to the powerful of his own tribe, to the Mala, to the tribal leadership of Quraysh. People are also part of a manipulative, plutocratic, capitalistic elite whose interest is in manipulation, whose interest is in political wheeling and dealing, and who have no interest in the life of the spirit. And again in the Quran, in the great prophetic stories in the Quran, we find this great showdown, which you might describe as a showdown between the Mashriq and the Maghrib, the place of the Ishraq, where the light is rising and there is new hope, and the place where the sun is setting after everybody is kind of tired after an exhausting day. What then is the answer to our inescapable question? The modern world is not something that we can simply pretend does not exist. Perhaps as recently as the 19th century one could do so. One could go to a small town and still live an entirely untroubled, happy, classical, believing life. But now even the smallest towns have been overwhelmed by this tsunami, and the young people in particular everywhere have been trapped by the advertising men and their insistence that everybody become entranced by the latest gadgets. Everybody is listening to the music of dunya, playing the games of dunya, and feeling the consequences in their hearts, in their relationship, in their spirituality. Everybody is participating in the modern cosmos. So where do we go? Well, what the type of hijrah that we have to make today? And remember that the Quranic metaphor for this is always hijrah. And in Arabic, hajra, hijran, has the sense of cold shouldering, turning your back on, renouncing, abandoning, just as Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam crosses the Red Sea. Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam moves from Mecca to Medina. We also have to make some form of internal hijrah. The external hijrah seems no longer to be possible. If you're fed up with the tsunami in your own country, where exactly do you go where it hasn't hit? It's hit now the smallest town in Mauritania or Saudi Arabia or Tibet. There is nowhere left where the flood has not penetrated. But the believer is not fazed by that, because he is convinced in the model of the cyclical. Not in our case, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to raise up a new prophet, although we are promised an Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, and we are confident in his arrival, but because we see that the principle of tajdeed in the Ummah has provided, as it were, smaller cycles within the larger cycle of prophetic history. And that the sun sets, but then the sun rises again. And the reason for that is that the human soul is not ultimately satisfied with bits and pieces, with gadgetry, and with false forms of entertainment. Because the human soul is crying out for an authentic nourishment. Mawlana Jalaluddin Rumi tells the story of a woman who has a baby, and she's a very inexperienced mother, and the baby is in her arms and it's crying and it's crying, and she wants it to stop crying. And so first of all she orders some kebab, some pieces of meat, offers them to the baby, but the baby doesn't eat the pieces of meat and the baby cries even louder. Then she offers the baby some bread, and the baby doesn't take the bread, it just cries still more. She offers the baby an apple, and the baby is impressed by the apple and cries still more, and she can't get any peace in her life because she can't get away from the baby is crying and it's noisy and she can't think, she can't do anything. And no prizes for guessing the moral of the story. Mawlana Rumi is saying that we all are holding a crying baby in our arms, which is the spirit. And the spirit is thirsty, and it's thirsty for the milk, which is dhikrullah, the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, alladhi bihi tatma'innu qulub, by which hearts find rest. We can offer our consciousness, our inward nature, our psyche, all of the gadgets and the bits and pieces and the latest music and the latest websites, but we will not find that those things are nourishing, because what the soul craves is something else. That is one ground for the optimism that the sun will rise again, perhaps in a modest way, until its final rising at the time of Imam Mahdi. But we have the confidence that the history of this ummah is cyclical, and the believer is always in a state of fa'n, or optimism. كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يحب الفأل. The Messenger صلى الله عليه وسلم used to love optimism. Pessimism is a kind of despair, and despair is near neighbor to kufr. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our Akhirah is always in charge of history. If this is a time of darkness and of shadows, zulumat, and people don't see the light very much, that's just an expression of Allah's jalal, of His rigor, but it is ultimately from His perfection. We are in this time of shadows, therefore the time of taghut in the Qur'an's language, the time of pharaonic preponderance. But we are also in a time where certain shafts of light are visible and have become evident to a number of Muslims who are reading the signs. Let's take a look at the nature of materialism itself. I've already indicated that even the BBC has decided that we're a lot less happy as a result of whatever it is that has happened over the last 50 years. But we also can see that philosophically and in terms of our physics, our understanding of the nature of matter, which defines the value of our materialism, certain curious things have taken place, which have challenged that basic paradigm for the materialistic worldview, which we call the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment as a false ishraq, the lumière, as the French put it, which they thought was going to replace the darkness of the Catholic Church. Look at our present-day conception of matter, for instance. The old Enlightenment was built on the assumption that the Newtonian physics represented the last word in the definition of matter, that everything is the consequence of measurable and calculable cause and effect. Since Einstein, Niels Bohr, and Heisenberg, we have instead been working with an uncertainty principle that sees the basic building blocks of matter not as being linked to each other according to formal, calculable principles, but on the basis of uncertainty and randomness. We have seen a development in our understanding of matter that makes the Enlightenment assurance that Newton's belief in causality was an appropriate measure for human conduct radically interrogated. So we have seen that the whole model of sababiyya, as we would call it, causality, has been turned on its head. How often we hear semi-educated modernists in the Islamic world blaming the Ash'aris or Imam al-Ghazali for the non-emergence of a scientific worldview. The Ash'aris famously deny, in their very subtle way, usually ungrasped by those thinkers, the fact of natural causality. However, we now know, with quantum mechanics, that causality, in the conventional sense that Ibn Sina, for instance, or the Mu'tazilites would have understood it, is in fact not what it seems to be. That instead, the relationship between cause and effect is something that is ungraspable. That we now know, and the physicists in Cambridge are certainly talking this way, that the present is the consequence not only of events in the past, but also of events in the future. Quantum mechanics insists that there are superluminary particles travelling faster than the speed of light, that therefore, on the quantum model, travel back in time. And these particles are influencing our current reality, the current configuration, the instantiation of matter that is in the now. This means that the future already exists. And this reverse causality, and if you look at any online encyclopedia of philosophy at reverse causality, you'll see how radical this perspective is, has given us to understand that the future already exists, and therefore time, understood as the development of future possibilities and latencies, which are multiple on the basis of current choices, is no longer what it seemed to be to Newtonian physics, and therefore to the materialists who framed the worldview at the time of the Enlightenment and subsequently. This is a radical perspective and seems to vindicate the Ash'ari view and also Imam al-Ghazali's view, which is that causality, although a helpful model in terms of what usually happens, what in our Akhirah we would call the Ada, is not a sufficient explanation of what things are. Similarly, the idea that the future is simply an unlimited range of unrealized possibilities has been largely discredited in favor of the perspective that the future is already there. Because if it is influencing the present, that means that it has an ontological reality which is already there, which is influencing us. The future already exists. And the determinist consequences of this for the Enlightenment belief in human free will, we are so glorious that we can do what we will and we can shape our own future, has been philosophically quite calamitous. The future is already there. Therefore, there is what we would call the qada and the qadar. It is already foreordained. قضي الأمر جف القدر. All of these formulations turn out to be entirely in conformity with what the physicists are now determining. That is one radical interrogation which late modernity poses to the Enlightenment model, and which makes a return to a classical religious perspective, not a modernist perspective that simply takes what it assumes to be the guiding assumptions of the modern world and magically discovers those assumptions in the Quran and the Sunnah, but a classical assumption, a Ghazalian assumption of the nature of reality, very credible, and which makes religion a far more intellectually and philosophically viable proposition than it was, for instance, 100 years ago, in the age of Victorian science, Edwardian science, when everything really seemed to be basically a mechanical process. Our view of reality now is far more dynamic, far more slippery. Another thing that seems to have taken place is that the deconstruction of the human persona, the modern understanding of the human self, has radically interrogated Enlightenment assumption number 2, which is that in the absence of defensible religious definitions of the human self, we have to accept an essentially materialistic assumption of the magnificent, integrated Renaissance personality, the self. The modern world is based on the assumption that the human self is a single, integrated thing that is glorious and that can do extraordinary things and fulfill itself and bring about its own happiness. Even many forms of modern spirituality, so-called, use as their guiding slogan the idea, discover yourself, be yourself, assert yourself. These are characteristic slogans of modernity. But what if we look at what the neurologists are now saying, or the latest generation of philosophers of mind are now saying, about the reality of our consciousness? And we will find that this foundation of the Enlightenment materialistic worldview, and essentially of our modern model of progress and materialism, has again been radically challenged and in fact blown out of the water. No longer do we believe that there is a single, integrated, glorious human personality or entity which is unchanging. Instead, we have a very vague, deconstructed, atomized view of the human consciousness as being a vague pattern of recollections and impulses and a false sense of linearity. One of the fundamental principles of modern philosophy is the deconstruction of the human subject. We are not really what we think we are. When we wake up every morning, the brain is reactivated and we have the illusion of continuity with the brain activity that was there the day before, but in fact there is no real linear continuity of the self. Again, as with physics, things tend to be atomized. That again has posed a radical challenge to the Enlightenment model, which is at the root of modern conceptions of progress and development and materialism and human fulfillment. And if we want another explanation, perhaps more profound than that proposed by the BBC, for why we're so unhappy nowadays, despite everything that we have in modern Britain, that might be a place to look. That we are promised that self will be fulfilled, but modernity has no definition of the self. What is the self? What is the human subject? It turns out to be a very feeble, fragile, easily unraveled thing. That has consequences also for ethics. Religionists have always been suspicious of materialism's ability to deliver selfless behavior, to deliver altruism. It is thought that on a materialistic model, people will simply act in their own interests, and there will be no rational grounds for acting in the interests of the human other. That attitude goes right back to the time of the trial of Socrates and beyond. It's a constant in the interface between forms of secularity and forms of religion, but in our context it becomes particularly acute. The modern world makes very grave moral claims for itself. On the one hand, it operates on materialistic premises. On the other hand, it develops things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It develops international law. It develops an ever-proliferating range of regulations which seem to be preserving the human right to integrity and fulfillment. That's a paradox which a number of people have pointed at as being increasingly fragile, as though a huge superstructure of human rights and ethics were being constructed on foundations that seem to be increasingly flimsy. If the human self has been deconstructed and turns to nothingness, if there is no ultimate external validation for our values, then on what does this huge superstructure actually rest? And much of the story of the 20th century, possibly, but not certainly in anticipation for what lies ahead, is the sudden collapse of ethics in the face of a challenge to its foundation. You look at the rise of National Socialism in Germany, for instance. You look at the rise of communism. You look at the rise of the great totalitarianisms of the 19th and 20th centuries. And you see the suddenness with which secular and liberal validations of the rights of others collapse and turn into nothing when somebody comes along with a different interpretation of human fulfillment and legitimacy. One of the dangers of liberalism is that philosophically it does seem to be built on extremely shaky ground. So for all of these reasons, we find ourselves as an ummah in a time that is not just a time of darkness and of objective sadness and confusion, but we also find ourselves at a time when the religious discourse actually seems to have a lot more to offer than it did a few generations ago. The Ash'ari paradigm turns out to be strikingly accessible to the advocates of modern cosmologists. 3 weeks ago in Cambridge, we hosted Professor Bruno Guiderdoni, who is the head of the French National Observatory in Lyon and is himself a convert to Islam. He's one of the world's leading experts on cosmology and the genesis of galaxies. And we asked him specifically about this convergence between the Ash'ari cosmology and view of matter and that which modern physicists are now evolving through string theory. And he says that there does seem to be a remarkable convergence and a remarkable compatibility. Clearly that doesn't mean that the function of the Muslim thinker in today's age is a simple, uncritical reproduction of a particular, as it were, screenshot of the evolution of the Ummah in some past age. To be traditional means to be part of a tradition, and traditions by their nature are moving through time and space. There is nothing in the presuppositions of the Quran and the Hadith and of our classical tradition that requires us to return to any given instantiation of Islamic interpretation in a past age, as if things could not move beyond that. But the perception has to be, again, that of the great ulama, such as Imam Nawawi, Imam Suyuti, Imam Ghazali, and the others, who held that there is no spiritual progress, but there can be an intellectual growth in sophistication that helps to slow spiritual decline. That if the modern age, any modern age, comes up with cognitive challenges to the claims of religion, then it is necessary to use the cognitive structures of the modern world, critically filtered and deployed in order to overcome those limitations. So that it is not enough to use a simple pietistic formula for refuting materialism. Neither is it enough simply to say that Imam Ghazali didn't believe in causality and therefore we shouldn't believe in causality. Instead, what is required, if we're to be traditional in the authentic, broad sense of the term, is to recognize the legitimacy of part of the discourse of every age. We do not throw out science, but we throw out the ideologies of materialism and the idealizing of the human self that a certain view of science can result in. We do not throw out modern conceptions of human rights and social boundaries, but we interrogate the philosophical foundations of secular human rights and ethics as being unduly flimsy. We may well find ourselves using much of the vocabulary of the age, just as the theologians of Islam have imported quite a bit of the vocabulary of ancient Greek metaphysics, for instance, or ancient Greek ethics. That's perfectly legitimate, as Imam Ghazali would see it as a hikmah dalatul mu'min. Wisdom is the lost riding beast of the believer. And it is permissible to borrow from Aristotle, for instance, who was substantially a pagan, then there is no religious barrier on the Ghazalian or classical Sunni understanding to borrowing from some of the conceptual armature of the modern world. However, the borrowing has to be based on an intellectually subtle filtration. Imam Ghazali says, when confronted with the Hellenistic legacy, the wise Muslim thinker is the one whose insight, his internal firasa has been purified so that he becomes like the money changer who is so familiar with money that he can recognize, just by touching it, what is a true coin from what is forgery. Similarly, when he says we look at the treasures of the ancient world, Greek logic and science and ethics and metaphysics, and wish to see what we can use in order to make Islam more credible to a generation that is oppressed by those categories, a certain kind of firasa, a spiritual insight is required to enable us to pick and choose, to find what is pure gold and to recognize that from what is a forgery. That, it seems to me, is the gift that Muslim scholars are required to cultivate when confronted by the complexity and often the undeniable conceptual richness of modernity. An uncritical adoption is in any case impossible because the system of modernity is not unified but has alternative interpretations. Just as there are rival interpretations within biology and physics, so too there are certainly many interpretations of the philosophy of mind, metaphysics, ethics, politics, and the rest. Modernity represents a spectrum of possibilities, not a single point of view. So an uncritical adaptation of modernity is in any case impossible. Nobody can take it all on because it contains too many contradictions. But as we look at the range of possibilities that are on offer, and we decide that certain of these things do speak to us, and even that at times certain contemporary forms of expressing wisdom may seem to sound truer in our ears than certain replications of medieval formulas, when, for instance, to use the language of quantum physics somehow brings more ease to our soul than to use a particular type of Aristotelian physics. When we find that modernity offers forms of expression that actually serve the life of the spirit rather than challenge it, we need to acquire this capacity for tamyiz, for discernment. How do we tell what is gold from what is false gold when so many people have been misled? When the world is full of people who simply have not been able to make the right decisions. People who are loosely labelled fundamentalists on the one hand and reject the modern world on moral grounds, but may be completely entranced by science. Or on the other hand, people who may think that the modern world in its essential structures represents some kind of realization of possibilities that in Islamic civilization were only latent, that weren't realized for various reasons that they scratch around to explain. Various forms of fundamentalism on the one hand, and on the other hand, various forms of liberalism and modernism on the other. Neither of those represent a correct sifting of the true from the false gold. What is required is something that will recognize that al-hikmah dalatul mu'min. Wisdom is the lost riding beast of the believer, and it is the believer that has the most right to it. فَهُوَ أَحَقُّ بِهَا. A concept, a formulation, a scientific insight, biological wisdom may be developed by an unbelieving mind. But when the believer appropriates it and sees what it means in terms of its belongingness to the pattern of Allah's creation, it is the believer who truly owns that concept. It is like a piece of conquered territory. Now, the ability to make that discernment of spirits, that tamyiz, is the subtlest thing, and the area in which many modern Muslim thinkers have not done terribly well. Because what Imam al-Ghazali is proposing is that a firasa is required, an intuition, that we have to know through this discernment of spirits what is a positive, contemporary form of religious expression and what is subversive. A huge responsibility, but one that we have no alternative to taking on. And his interpretation is that it is the fitrah, the fundamental positive disposition, the theomorphic essence of the base of the human consciousness, which is the basis for making those decisions. Which means that if the human consciousness is overcome by moral weakness or by complexes of envy, insecurity, anger, defensiveness, that we all make the wrong decisions. And the great calamity of the Ummah at the moment is a mindset which, based on the understandable believing aversion to the triviality of the modern world, wishes to reject every aspect of its discourse while adopting uncritically the scientific foundations of that discourse. And this is the ideology of Islamic radicalism, of fundamentalism, which is ultimately an expression of ego, of nafs. Its basic rage, its hamiyya, is the hamiyya of the jahiliyyah. It is that envy and resentment that existed amongst the tribes of the ancient Arabs. It is that sense of primacy and envy and insecurity that was the mindset of Fir'aun. It is the mentality of the other side. This hamiyya, this rage, this envy is the jahili quality. And when that jahili energy, which is from the nafs, which is from the ego, which is from our insecurity, from our fearfulness of the other, is turned into the driving energy of religion, then that is the most profound subversion that can ever take place. And the ugliest things on the planet are those manifestations of religion that are driven by ego rather than by the spirit. That is a huge danger. The Kharijite energy which emerged at the beginning of the religion. Kalimatu haqqin urida biha batil, a true word by which batil, falsehood, is deeply intended. يَمْرُقُونَ مِنَ الدِّينِ كَمَا يَمْرُقُ السَّهْمُ مِنَ الرَّمِيَّةِ, the famous hadith of Dhul Khuwaysira, which the ulama always invoke as an indication of that particular mindset. Such people go into religion so hard that they come out the other side like an arrow through its target. And the nature of that hardness is precisely the anger and the rage, the frustration, the insecurity, the psychic traumas of the overwhelmed citizen of the third world when he sees the superior technique of his historical enemies. That is the inversion of true religion. It is the importation of the Jahili principle of rage and envy and hamiyya into the spiritual metabolism of Islam, and its results are the Khariji mindset that opposed Imam Ali and eventually resulted in his assassination, if one could imagine a greater crime. That is where it ends. It ends in self-destruction, in suicidal tendencies. That is one possibility which we see when this wisdom, this capacity to sort out the true gold from the false gold, is not cultivated. And the opposite pole is that of the uncritical acceptance of modernity, the envy of modernity again, the assumption being that what we need to do is to become just like them, but perhaps keeping the hijab and keeping certain of our traditions intact, but the underlying logic of legislation, the values and the priority of life being indistinguishable from those of the secular world. That also is symptomatic of a fundamental loss of wisdom and of hikmah, and also of yaqeen. What's required, as always, and this is very much the Ghazalian way, is the way of the middle. Khayrul umuri awsatuha, the best of all matters is the middle course. And Imam al-Ghazali explains that that is not the same as the easiest course. It is quite easy to switch your mind off and be the uncritical imitator of a fundamentalist faction, one of whose conditions for membership is that you don't use your brain any longer. Or to be the uncritical follower of some liberal faction that assumes that basically the discourse of the modern world is where Muslims need to be, and again, you don't need a critical faculty any longer. To be in the middle is actually the hardest place to be. And it's the sirat mustaqim, the path of those who are غَيْرَ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ, one of whose meanings is, presumably, one can say, by ta'wil, precisely this. And that sirat mustaqim is a tricky place to be, but its compensation is that it is the place where you will find this tuma'nina, where you will find exclusively this ease in the soul. The enraged radical will not find that calmness in his soul, of which the Quran speaks. And the mindless liberal, the modernist, the conformist, will not find that calmness in his soul, because deep down he knows that he's missing something and that he is a sellout. He has the guilt of the traitor gnawing away at his soul at some level. He'll never quite be able to get away from that. But the one who is in the state of al-qalb al-salim is the one who has found this middle path, which is not a path of indulgence or a path of moderation in this sense. Remember that I said that moderation in an Islamic response to the modern world is essentially a contradiction in terms. He is still a radical, but his radicalism consists in denying the logic of the modern world that always pushes one to one extreme or the other. What flourishes under modern conditions is either mindless fundamentalism or mindless conformism to the growing modern consumerist monoculture. That's what thrives nowadays. What doesn't thrive is wisdom, beauty, truth, tradition, selflessness, and humility. Those are the rare properties, but those are undeniably the properties which the Sirat al-Mustaqim enjoins upon us. So to wind up this first session, and the second session, inshallah, will be given over largely to questions and a discussion. Let me just try and recap. I've indicated that the quality of gharib, which is the required quality of of the believer, particularly in an age of estrangement from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, such as ours, where people are given absolutely everything except what is essential to their humanity. That this necessary quality of the believer as a stranger or a wayfarer makes it impossible for us to be moderates in the conventional media sense of the word. Our perception, because we are dissidents regarding the modern materialist consumer enterprise, does turn us into radicals. But it is not the superficial, rage-based radicalism of the fundamentalist extreme, nor is it the extremism of the market fundamentalist, but instead it's something more profound, something that is based on our awareness that we are abir as-sabil, that we are just passing through. Imam Jalaluddin Rumi says, "Sa'asimani tulchu baran bimam al-akhirah bihabsui bilabidin bina bidan rafti." In one of his great ghazals, he says that you are like a raindrop which falls from the sky upon the clay roof of this world, which rushes around for a while and then disappears out of the gutter. That's what we are. Human souls, which are not of this world, but are from the divine world, the world of the arwah, come down upon this clay world for a while and rush around, sullying themselves, and then leave by the same point of exit, the same drain, which is the grave. We're here for only a brief time, but our true home is somewhere else. Our true home is the heavens. Imam Jalaluddin Rumi in the same ghazal says, "Finally you spread your wings and leave this world, a wonder, a true miracle it is by which path you leave this world." And then, "Tulbaz ikhlas wadi dar basar pirzani chu tab libas shenidi bila mikan rafti." You are a royal falcon in the grip of an old woman. In other words, what we truly are is birds born to soar up high in the empyrean higher regions, but we are in the grip of an old woman. The harshness of dunya has grabbed us. A false beauty has entrapped us, like a beautiful eagle grabbed by a lower principle. But then you manage to escape and you go to the place where there is no place, Bila Mikan, the place where there is no Makan, because that is our home. And that is the basic agenda of Islamic radicalism. The perception that we are briefly ensouled in these bodies of clay, but that there is within us a nostalgia for the real place, the point of our origin, the Bazmi Alast, the day of Alastu bi Rabbikum, am I not your Lord, for which we all crave, and for which we have this deep nostalgia that is a growing pit, the chasm within our consciousness, into which the modern world pours all of its gadgets and music and its forms of distraction, but by its very nature can't fill that hole and can't paper it over. And hence we have this huzn of which I spoke, which the BBC recently disclosed, that we are all, despite everything, sadder than we have been in past generations. But that's the true nature of Islamic intellectuality in our age. It's to recognize that the believer is between these 2 points, but is not a moderate. That the believer's radicalism consists in his being at the middle, and consists in his ability to use a deeper wisdom that has nothing to do with the modern trivial definition of human consciousness. The collapse of the Enlightenment self, much wanted, now turns to nothing. But the access to a deeper wisdom, which is ultimately this nostalgia, this yearning for the Alastu bi Rabbikum, and the desire for al-qalb al-salim, which is at the basis of our souls. So that's what the Muslim intellectual has to be in our age. And we often misuse this term aql, this term intelligence, It doesn't just mean smartness, brain work. Aqala in Arabic means that which hobbles, that which stops the camel from wandering off in the night. It's the cords that you wrap around its legs. And therefore it means that setting of boundaries to the free-floating wanderings of the human consciousness that enable us to direct our thoughts and therefore to become conscious and directed and integrated human beings. That's not just a process of logic chopping, but it entails more profoundly a sense of purpose and a sense of hikmah, this great blessing which we are enjoined by the Holy Quran to pray for. And that hikmah is what enables us, when confronted by the conceptual jungle of modernity and the endless perplexities presented to us by modern science, which enables us to sort out the true gold from the dross, and therefore to begin to construct an Islamic theology that will not just satisfy the yearnings of our minds and our souls, but will once again represent the ummah to other ummahs in its true and glorious barak, attractive, luminous sense, which at the moment the outside world does not see. At the moment, the outside world receives from us books and pamphlets and conferences which are about religion as ideology, religion as narrow fundamentalism, or religion as some kind of justification for science, scientific discoveries in the Quran, a lot of apologetic rhetoric produced by defeated souls, but nowhere does it see what is most integral to our tradition, which is the tradition of kalam, the tradition of our theology, and the tradition of our spirituality, which are the areas in which the Ummah has historically worked out the justification, the hujjah for itself. Only when we return to that authentic, wisdom-driven intellectuality will we actually be an Ummah of da'wah, rather than an Ummah that endlessly receives. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, to open our hearts to this wisdom so that we become people not just of logic chopping and of cleverness, but of true deep inward stillness and wisdom, people who restrain themselves and know themselves so that they can go on to know and to understand the needs of the world and the rights that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has over them. Barakallahu.